Hello and welcome to this video on variation and evolution, where our main focus will be natural selection. If we look at all of these domestic dogs at the top of the screen, you can see that they are all different. They have different sizes, different shapes, some have short fur, some have long fur. And if you were to look behind the silhouettes, you will see that the fur comes in a variety of different colours and each dog will have a different temperament. All these differences are called variations, and they're caused by random continuous mutations in the genetic information or the DNA. Now, often those mutations don't affect any of the characteristics of the individual. Sometimes they have a really detrimental effect on those characteristics, leading to the formation of a disease. Sometimes those mutations confer an advantageous characteristic which can help drive the evolution of a new species. So what is meant by a species? Well, essentially a species is a group of organisms with similar characteristics that can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So a Great Dane, for example, will be able to mate with a poodle, a Labrador could mate with a Dalmatian, and the puppies of each of those crosses are fertile. They can grow up and produce puppies of their own someday. Now, there are certain animals that do look very similar. An example would be like a lion and a tiger, and these are two big cats, quite similar in temperament, but they live on completely different continents. One has stripes, one doesn't. And on rare occasions in captivity, they have been mated together to produce a cub that is a hybrid of the two species. The difference between that cross and the crosses between these dog breeds is that hybrid of a tiger and a lion will not be able to produce offspring of its own. And it's all down to how many chromosomes a species has. The domestic dog actually has 78 chromosomes as its diploid number in 39 pairs, as does the dog that it's descended from, the grey wolf. And for this reason, because the grey wolf also has 78 chromosomes, the domestic dog can be bred with the grey wolf to produce a hybrid that is fertile. On the other hand, another member of the dog family is the red fox. None of the domestic dog breeds, nor the grey wolf or anything like that, can actually breed with a red fox to produce viable offspring or fertile offspring. And this is down to the fact that the red fox has a much smaller diploid chromosome number of 34 chromosomes in total. So therefore, the domestic dog, Canis lupus familiaris, and the grey wolf, Canis lupus, are the same species. They're just in slightly different subspecies groups, but all of those dogs are more distantly related to the fox. Are these differences, are these variations due primarily to genetics, or is there more to the story? Well, the best way to study whether or not the environment has a role to play in creating these variations within an individual is to look at identical twins, because they do share the same DNA, and it's much easier to look at characteristics and work out which ones are just down to the genotype of the individual and those that are influenced by the environment. So identical twins are born looking identical, acting identical, but as they start to grow, differences are noted. And the older they get, the more different they become. There are certain things that won't change, and these characteristics are just due to genotype only. Gender cannot naturally change. Blood group, whether or not you have curved or straight thumbs, whether or not you have dimples, whether or not you have dangly earlobes, all of these things are down to your genes, and one gene in particular, two different variants of the gene or two different alleles, but the environment has no influence on that. And if you were to do a class survey of characteristics that are just down to your genotype, whereby you go around and generate a tally of people that are either male or female, have dimples, don't have dimples, or a particular blood group, you'll always produce a bar chart where the bars are just random heights. There would not be a pattern. There are certain characteristics that are just down to the environment, such as whether or not you have an accent, whether or not you have a tan, and you're not born with scars or tattoos. That's just down to your environment. However, majority of your characteristics are a marriage between your genotype and the environment. And again, if you were to do like a class survey of these characteristics, you'd actually plot a line graph that would have this bell-shaped curve. So characteristics that are a combination of both environment and genotype include height, weight, skin colour. So in your class, there will be more people that have an average height, and this gets plotted at the top of that red curve. And there will be people that are at the extremes, like really short people, really tall people, but there'll be fewer of those individuals in the class. And as a result, they'll be at the other ends of that red line. Now, genetically speaking, you have parents that might be very tall or might be very short, and you inherit from them a potential height. But what you eat and what you do influence whether you reach or surpass that potential height. Similarly with weight, there's lots of genes that influence your metabolism, and there's obesity genes that could trigger you to a life of excessive eating and obesity. The genes that you inherit from your parents are not a sentence. Your lifestyle can really influence how those genes are activated. So there's a lot going on really in genetics, making it quite a complicated topic. Is variation important? Well, for a species to evolve and to change, variation is essential, and natural selection, which is a driving force of evolution, depends primarily on there being variation. So whenever you get a natural selection question in your GCSE papers, and it does come up in several topics, there's always like a sequence of events in the whole process of natural selection. And the first step in that sequence that you need to mention is that there is already variation in a population. So a group of individuals of the same species is a population, and there'll be lots and lots of differences in that population. These differences are due to mutations, which I've mentioned earlier, which are random, continuous changes in the DNA. And these mutations have an effect on our characteristics. Some of those characteristics are advantageous. They will help the individual with that characteristic to survive. If you survive and reach reproductive age, you've got more chance of reproducing. And if you have reproduced, you've made offspring, and those offspring will have inherited or are likely to have inherited the advantageous characteristic. If this characteristic continues to be advantageous in the environment, then more and more generations will be producing offspring with those characteristics, and the frequency of that characteristic in the population will increase over time. A classic textbook example of natural selection is looking at the peppered moth. So there is a type of moth that lives in Britain, and at some point a mutation occurred and created a melanic form, the dark version of this moth, which was different to the paler version of the moth pictured on the right. Now, when moths aren't flying around, they like to rest, and they often rest on the bark of a tree. And there's another kind of microscopic organism that likes to live on the bark of these trees called lichen. And lichen is an organism that arises from algae living along filaments of a fungus. And to our eyes, it looks like kind of a white, green, speckled moss that you might find on brick walls or on the bark of trees. So if you happen to be the paler, speckled form of this peppered moth, and you're resting on one of those trees, you're pretty well camouflaged. And as a result, predators aren't as likely to see you as a melanic, darker version of this moth. As a result, the predators will pick off the darker, more obvious one. And as a result of picking those moths up, one might just escape being seen by a predator. The light, paler versions of this moth will stay put, and as a result, they'll live to reproduce, and over generation and generation and generation, you'll get a higher frequency of the light, pale version of this moth, and the numbers of the melanic, darker version of the moth will decrease. And at some point, the melanic version of this moth was on the brink of being wiped out, until Britain went through an industrial revolution. And the pollution that this caused killed off these lichen, which are really sensitive to air pollutants like sulfur dioxide. They just can't cope in those conditions. So they die off, they won't be on the bark of trees. So there's no longer this white background, and also the soot that was generated from all the factory smoke stuck to the trees instead. So now if you happen to be the melanic dark version of this moth, you're laughing, because when you're resting on the trees, you're the one in disguise now, you're the one that's camouflaged, and the white, pale versions are standing out. And as a result, birds will see the white version or the pale version and start to pick them off and eat them. These ones won't survive and they won't reproduce. The melanic versions, however, do survive and they reproduce. A few pale versions will escape the clutches of the predators, but lo and behold, the next generation, there's a larger frequency of the melanic darker version than the light one, and this will continue. Jump forward to today, we have both variations of the pepper moth still in existence, but you're unlikely to find the dark melanic version of the moth in the countryside. You're more likely to see that one when you go into polluted areas like cities. In the countryside, the pale version will be the one that you're likely to see. Over many generations, if natural selection keeps driving forward one particular advantageous characteristic, it will eventually lead to the evolution of that species, whereby the characteristics that get inherited into the next generation of that population will change over time. If it wasn't for the Industrial Revolution, the melanic version of the pepper moth would have been wiped out, and the pepper moth would have evolved to just be the paler version. However, nature hasn't selected that outcome. So variation is very, very important and sets the foundation for nature to start acting on the advantageous variations of genes that could then lead to the evolution within a species, whereby the changes are so significant that the new species will no longer be able to interbreed with the ancestral species to produce fertile offspring. Thanks for watching. Do check in again soon.